Picture this. You're 14 years old, standing in a marble courtyard beneath the blazing sun of Isfahan in 1650 AD. Your silk robes, dyed the deepest purple money can buy, cling to your trembling body as eunuch guards with curved daggers escort you through corridors lined with precious stones. The sound of your bare feet echoes against polished floors that reflect your terrified face back at you. Through latticed windows, you catch glimpses of the world you'll never return to. The dusty streets where normal boys your age learn trades from their fathers, where they court village girls and dream of simple futures. But you're not walking toward a simple future. You're walking toward the hidden chambers of the Shah's most guarded secret, a place where beauty becomes currency and youth becomes a commodity more valuable than gold or silk. Behind these walls lies a truth so shocking that Persian historians spent centuries burying it, a system so elaborate and disturbing that even hardened diplomats from Europe would flee the court rather than witness what happened when darkness fell across the palace grounds. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Persian Empire that stretched from India to the Mediterranean wasn't just built on military conquest and trade routes. It was sustained by secrets, by practices so carefully hidden that they existed in the shadows between official court records and whispered rumors that traveled along the Silk Road. While European visitors marveled at the Shah's golden throne and the geometric perfection of Persian gardens, they remained blind to what happened in the private quarters, in chambers where young boys disappeared and emerged as something else entirely if they emerged at all. Shah Abbas the Great, who ruled from 1588 to 1629 AD, transformed Persia into a cultural powerhouse that rivaled anything Europe could offer. His capital at Isfahan became known as half the world, a city where architecture reached toward heaven and poetry flowed like wine. But Abbas had appetites that couldn't be satisfied by conquest or artistic achievement. He needed something more intimate, more personal, more forbidden. The Safavid court developed an institution that had no name in any official document, referred to only in coded language by those who dared speak of it at all. They called it the Garden of Nightingales, though no birds sang within its walls. European travelers who managed to gain access to the Persian court left behind accounts that historians have struggled to interpret for centuries. Thomas Herbert, an English diplomat who visited Isfahan in 1627 AD, wrote cryptically about the Shah's particular fondness for beautiful youth, noting that certain young men seemed to hold positions of influence that had nothing to do with their families or military achievements. Pietro della Valle, an Italian nobleman who spent years in Persia, described elaborate evening entertainments where young men performed for the Shah's private pleasure, their faces painted with cosmetics that made them appear almost feminine, their movements trained in arts that no decent Persian father would teach his son. But these fragmentary accounts barely hint at the systematic nature of what the Safavid court had created. This wasn't simply a matter of individual preference or occasional indulgence. It was an institution as carefully organized as the empire's tax collection system, as ruthlessly efficient as its military campaigns. Young boys, typically between the ages of 12 and 16, were recruited from across the empire through methods that varied from outright purchase to elaborate deceptions that convinced families they were sending their sons to prestigious educational opportunities. The selection process alone reveals the calculating nature of this hidden system. Court officials traveled throughout Persian territories with specific criteria, seeking boys who possessed not just physical beauty, but particular combinations of features that appealed to refined tastes. Fair skin was prized, especially the pale complexions found among mountain peoples. Delicate bone structure mattered more than strength or height. Most importantly, they sought boys who displayed what they termed malleability, a quality that had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with the capacity for psychological manipulation. Families who sold their sons often believed they were providing opportunities for advancement. The recruiters spoke eloquently about education at the royal court, about positions in the imperial administration that would elevate entire bloodlines. They displayed silk clothing and gold coins as evidence of the prosperity that awaited. What they didn't mention was that boys who entered the Garden of Nightingales rarely maintained contact with their families and never returned home unchanged, if they returned at all. The physical transformation began immediately upon arrival at the court. Boys were bathed in water scented with rose oil and jasmine, their bodies examined by physicians who recorded every detail in ledgers that read like livestock inventories. Those who passed initial inspections were assigned to specialized trainers who would spend months or years reshaping not just their appearance, but their entire sense of self. The process was designed to create beings who existed between traditional categories, neither fully male nor female, neither child nor adult, neither free nor enslaved. Persian court records written in the flowery language that disguised brutal realities describe educational programs that sound almost benign until you understand their true purpose. Boys learned poetry and music, but only verses and melodies that celebrated submission and devotion. They studied dance, but movements designed to display their bodies in ways that emphasized vulnerability and availability. They practiced calligraphy, but copying texts that gradually eroded their sense of individual identity and replaced it with absolute loyalty to their master's desires. The psychological conditioning was perhaps even more systematic than the physical training. Boys were isolated from each other during their initial months, prevented from forming the friendships that might provide emotional support or opportunities for resistance. They were given new names, often feminine variants of their birth names, and forbidden to speak of their families or previous lives. Gradually, through a combination of rewards for compliance and punishments for defiance, they learned that survival depended on anticipating and fulfilling desires they had never imagined. The court employed specialists whose only function was managing this transformation process. These weren't crude overseers, but sophisticated manipulators who understood the delicate balance between breaking a boy's will and preserving the spirit that made him valuable. Too much force created broken creatures who couldn't perform their expected roles. Too little guidance left boys with enough independence to resist or escape. The most skilled handlers could reshape a personality while convincing their subject that the changes were voluntary, even desirable. Medical texts from the period, preserved in private libraries that remained closed to scholars for centuries, reveal the extent to which this system was supported by scientific knowledge. Court physicians documented the effects of various treatments designed to alter physical development, delay masculine maturation, and maintain the androgynous appearance that Persian aesthetics demanded. Some boys received dietary modifications that affected their growth patterns. Others underwent treatments that would be considered barbaric by any medical standard, procedures designed to preserve a childlike appearance well past the normal age of physical maturity. The hierarchy within the Garden of Nightingales reflected the broader Persian obsession with rank and status. New arrivals occupied the lowest positions, serving not just the Shah and his intimate circle, but also boys who had been in the system longer and earned privileges through successful performance of their duties. This created a twisted mentorship system where older boys trained younger ones, passing down techniques for survival while competing for the favor that meant the difference between luxury and degradation. Those who showed exceptional aptitude for their roles could rise to positions of genuine influence within the court. Some became confidants who heard state secrets while providing intimate services. Others developed reputations as entertainers whose performances at private gatherings could make or break political careers. A few achieved something approaching independence, accumulating wealth and property while maintaining their relationships with powerful patrons. But even the most successful never escaped entirely. They remained dependent on the system that had created them, unable to form normal relationships or integrate into conventional society. The evening rituals that gave the Garden of Nightingales its true purpose were conducted with the same elaborate ceremony that characterized all Persian court functions. Boys were prepared like living artworks, their skin painted with precious pigments, their hair arranged in styles that took hours to complete, their bodies adorned with jewelry that emphasized their youth and availability. They learned to move through these preparations with practiced grace, understanding that resistance would only make the inevitable more painful, Contemporary accounts from European visitors who witnessed these preparations describe scenes that seem to exist outside normal human experience. The boys appeared almost ethereal, their carefully cultivated beauty enhanced by cosmetics and lighting that created an atmosphere of otherworldly luxury. Yet beneath the aesthetic perfection lay a system of control so complete that these young men had been trained to anticipate desires before they were spoken, to respond to subtle gestures with practiced compliance, to endure experiences that would destroy most people while maintaining expressions of apparent pleasure. The Shah and his inner circle justified these practices through elaborate philosophical frameworks that portrayed them as expressions of refined culture rather than systematic abuse. They claimed that relationships with beautiful boys represented a higher form of love than the crude biological drives that motivated common people. They argued that by removing these young men from conventional society, they were preserving and perfecting human beauty like rare flowers in a private garden. Most perversely, they suggested that the boys themselves benefited from experiences that elevated them above their humble origins and provided them with opportunities for spiritual development through submission to superior beings. Persian poetry from this period, much of it composed by court writers who had access to these hidden chambers, reveals the elaborate literary culture that surrounded and justified the Garden of Nightingales. Verses celebrated the beauty of youth while lamenting its transience, praised the wisdom of older men who could appreciate such beauty, and described love in terms that deliberately obscured the power dynamics involved. This wasn't simply artistic expression, but propaganda designed to normalize practices that most of the empire's subjects would have found horrifying if they had understood their true nature. The recruitment system extended far beyond Persia's borders, drawing boys from territories that recognized Persian suzerainty and even from neighboring empires through networks that combined diplomatic relations with human trafficking. Georgian princes sent their youngest sons as tribute, believing they were cementing political alliances. Central Asian tribes offered their most beautiful boys in exchange for favorable trade agreements. Indian merchants included human cargo alongside silk and spices, understanding that youth commanded premium prices in Persian markets. The logistics of maintaining this hidden empire required resources that rivaled military campaigns. Specialized quarters were constructed within palace complexes, designed with acoustics that prevented screams from reaching public areas while allowing music and laughter to filter through when required for theatrical effect. Architects who designed these spaces were often eliminated after completion, ensuring that knowledge of secret passages and hidden chambers died with their creators. The most skilled craftsmen in the empire contributed to environments that combined luxury with security, beauty with imprisonment. Food preparation for the Garden of Nightingales followed protocols that would have impressed the most paranoid ruler. Every meal was tested not just for poison, but for substances that might affect the boy's appearance, mood, or compliance. Court physicians prescribed specific diets for different stages of training, understanding that nutrition could be weaponized as effectively as any blade. Boys who showed signs of rebellion might find their meals adjusted to include herbs that clouded thinking or reduced physical energy. Those who pleased their handlers received foods that enhanced their appearance and vitality. The training regimen extended far beyond physical appearance and submission techniques. Boys learned to read the subtle political currents of court life, understanding that survival often depended on anticipating which nobles were rising in favor and which were falling from grace. They developed skills in gathering and reporting information, becoming unwitting spies who could access conversations and documents that formal intelligence networks couldn't reach. Their apparent powerlessness made them nearly invisible to those who discussed state secrets in their presence, never imagining that these beautiful ornaments possessed sharp minds and excellent memories. Religious justification for these practices required creative interpretation of Islamic law and Persian cultural traditions. Court clerics developed elaborate theological arguments that portrayed the Garden of Nightingales as a form of religious devotion, claiming that the beauty of youth reflected divine perfection, and that serving such beauty brought one closer to God. They cited mystical texts that described spiritual love in terms that could be twisted to justify physical relationships, and they created new interpretations of paradise that included eternal youth as reward for earthly devotion to beautiful beings. The seasonal rhythms of court life determined when and how the Garden of Nightingales operated at full capacity. During winter months, when the court remained in Isfahan, elaborate indoor entertainments provided regular opportunities for private gatherings where the boys performed their primary functions. Spring brought hunting expeditions to mountain retreats, where smaller groups of selected boys accompanied the Shah and his intimates to isolated locations where normal social constraints disappeared entirely. Summer progresses to other cities required careful planning to ensure that favorite boys traveled safely while maintaining the secrecy that protected the system from public scrutiny. Communication within the Garden of Nightingales developed its own coded language that allowed boys to share information and provide mutual support while appearing to engage in innocent conversation. They learned to convey warnings about particularly dangerous clients through arrangements of flowers or musical choices during performances. They developed signals that indicated when someone needed immediate help or when a gathering was turning violent. Most importantly, they created ways to maintain human connections, despite a system designed to isolate them from meaningful relationships. The economic impact of maintaining this institution extended throughout Persian society in ways that participants and beneficiaries rarely acknowledged. Entire industries developed around supplying the specialized goods required for the boys' care and presentation. Silk merchants prospered by providing fabrics in specific colors and textures that enhanced youthful appearance. Jewelers created ornaments designed to emphasize delicate features. Perfume makers developed scents that combined luxury with psychological manipulation, using fragrances that created associations between pleasure and compliance. Medical knowledge accumulated through the systematic abuse of these boys contributed to advances in understanding human psychology and physical development that Persian physicians would never have admitted publicly. They learned techniques for managing trauma that kept victims functional, while preventing recovery that might lead to resistance. They discovered methods for maintaining physical health in individuals subjected to extreme psychological stress. Most disturbingly, they developed expertise in recognizing and exploiting the specific vulnerabilities that made some people more susceptible to manipulation than others. The international dimensions of the Garden of Nightingales created diplomatic complications that required careful management by court officials who understood both the system's importance to their rulers and its potential for creating scandals that could damage Persia's relationships with other powers. European ambassadors who discovered evidence of these practices faced difficult choices between reporting what they had witnessed and maintaining the diplomatic relationships their nations required for trade and military cooperation. Most chose silence, but their private correspondence reveals the moral struggles of men who prioritized political necessity over human decency. Competition between different Persian courts intensified the demand for exceptional boys while driving innovations in recruitment and training techniques. Regional governors who hoped to gain favor with the Shah understood that presenting him with particularly beautiful or talented boys could advance their careers more effectively than military victories or administrative efficiency. This created a marketplace where human beings were evaluated according to criteria that reduced them to collections of physical attributes and psychological vulnerabilities. The boys themselves developed strategies for psychological survival that demonstrated remarkable resilience despite circumstances designed to destroy individual identity. Some created elaborate fantasy lives that allowed them to mentally escape during the worst experiences while maintaining enough awareness to avoid punishments that came with obvious resistance. Others formed clandestine emotional bonds that provided support networks within the system's constraints. A few managed to preserve core aspects of their original personalities by compartmentalizing their experiences, treating their roles as performances while protecting inner selves that remained untouched by their circumstances. Documentation of individual cases reveals the human cost of the system in terms that official records never acknowledged. Court physicians' private notes describe boys who developed mysterious illnesses that had no physical causes, symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as manifestations of severe psychological trauma. They recorded cases of boys who stopped eating despite access to luxury foods, who developed nervous conditions that made them unsuitable for their intended purposes, who suffered what were described as melancholic episodes that sometimes ended in suicide attempts. The artistic legacy of the Garden of Nightingales influenced Persian cultural production in ways that remained visible long after the institution itself disappeared. Poetry from this period shows clear influence from the aesthetic philosophy that justified these practices, with recurring themes about the transience of beauty and the wisdom of older men who could appreciate youthful perfection. Painting and miniature work from Safavid courts includes recurring motifs that celebrate androgynous beauty while depicting power relationships that modern viewers can recognize as illustrations of systematic abuse disguised as refined culture. Escape from the Garden of Nightingales was theoretically possible, but practically nearly impossible due to the psychological conditioning that made boys dependent on the system that enslaved them. Those who managed to flee often found themselves unable to integrate into normal society, lacking the skills and social connections necessary for independent survival. Their altered appearance and psychological conditioning marked them as different in ways that made them vulnerable to exploitation by new masters who might be less refined but equally ruthless in their treatment of human property. The network of suppliers who fed the Garden of Nightingales extended into the darkest corners of the empire, reaching families so desperate that they convinced themselves they were providing opportunities rather than condemning their children to living hell. Village headmen received commissions for identifying boys who met the court's specific requirements, creating incentive systems that turned community leaders into talent scouts for systematic abuse. Traveling merchants carried more than silk and spices along their routes, transporting human cargo wrapped in lies about educational opportunities and promising futures in the imperial administration. The selection criteria evolved over decades of experimentation, becoming increasingly specific as court officials learned which physical and psychological characteristics produced the most valuable additions to their collection. They preferred boys from mountain regions, believing that harsh climates produced hardier constitutes who could survive the transformation process. They sought children from broken families, understanding that boys with weak emotional support systems were less likely to resist conditioning or attempt escape. Most cynically, they targeted the sons of minor nobles who had fallen from favor, knowing that these boys possessed the refined manners that made them immediately suitable for court life, while their families lacked the political power to demand their return. Training protocols divided boys into categories that determined their eventual roles within the system. Those deemed most beautiful were reserved for the Shah's personal use, undergoing the most intensive conditioning to ensure absolute compliance with desires that grew more elaborate and dangerous as rulers became bored with conventional pleasures. Boys with exceptional musical or poetic talents were developed as entertainers who could provide intellectual stimulation alongside physical gratification, learning to compose verses that celebrated their own degradation while maintaining expressions of artistic inspiration. Those who showed particular intelligence were trained as confidants and spies, taught to gather information while appearing to focus solely on providing pleasure to their targets. The medical interventions used to maintain the boy's value became increasingly sophisticated as court physicians developed expertise in manipulating human development. They discovered combinations of herbs and dietary restrictions that could delay the onset of masculine characteristics, preserving the androgynous appearance that Persian aesthetics demanded. Some boys received treatments with substances that affected their voices, preventing the natural deepening that marked transition to adulthood. Others underwent procedures that would remain unthinkable in any legitimate medical context, operations designed to maintain physical characteristics that emphasized vulnerability and availability. Psychological conditioning techniques evolved through generations of experimentation, as handlers learned to break down individual identity while preserving the spark of personality that made each boy unique and valuable. The process began with isolation, separating new arrivals from any source of emotional support while surrounding them with luxury that created confusion about their circumstances. Gradually, through carefully calibrated rewards and punishments, boys learned that survival depended on anticipating and fulfilling desires they couldn't understand. Developing hyper-awareness of subtle cues that indicated approval or displeasure from those who controlled their fate. The hierarchy within the Garden of Nightingales created its own twisted ecosystem of competition and cooperation. Boys who had survived their initial conditioning became mentors to newer arrivals, teaching survival techniques while competing for the favor that meant the difference between privilege and punishment. This system ensured that victims became complicit in perpetuating the abuse that had destroyed their own innocence, creating cycles of trauma that bound the community together through shared degradation rather than mutual support. Evening entertainment in the private quarters followed rituals as elaborate as any religious ceremony, with boys prepared like offerings to gods whose appetites grew more demanding with each passing season. The preparation process could take entire days, with specialists attending to every detail of appearance and presentation. Cosmetics were applied with artistic precision to create illusions of ethereal beauty that transcended normal human categories. Hair was arranged in styles that took hours to complete, often incorporating jewels and precious metals that emphasized the boy's value as luxury objects rather than human beings. The performances themselves varied according to the preferences of different patrons, but all shared certain characteristics that revealed the calculating nature of this system. Boys learned to read the emotional states of their audiences with supernatural accuracy, adjusting their behavior to provide exactly the type of stimulation that would produce maximum satisfaction without triggering violence or boredom. They developed repertoires of songs, dances, and conversation topics that could be combined in different ways to create illusions of spontaneity, while following scripts designed to manipulate their listeners' responses. Private quarters where these activities occurred were architectural marvels that combined luxury with security in ways that served both practical and psychological functions. Rooms were designed with acoustics that allowed music and laughter to filter through to public areas while preventing screams or pleas for help from reaching potential rescuers. Lighting systems created atmospheres that enhanced the boy's appearance while casting shadows that concealed details observers might find disturbing. Most importantly, these spaces were constructed with multiple exits and hidden passages that allowed rapid evacuation if circumstances required removing evidence of activities that occurred within their walls. The seasonal calendar of the Persian court determined when different aspects of the Garden of Nightingales operated at full capacity. Winter months in Isfahan provided opportunities for elaborate indoor entertainments, where large groups of boys performed for audiences that included visiting dignitaries who were gradually introduced to practices they might initially find shocking. Spring hunting expeditions to mountain retreats allowed for more intimate gatherings where normal social constraints disappeared entirely, and the most extreme activities could occur without risk of unwanted observation. Communication systems within the hidden quarters developed their own coded languages that allowed boys to share information and provide mutual support while appearing to engage in innocent activities. Musical selections during performances could convey warnings about particularly dangerous clients or indicate when someone needed immediate assistance. Arrangements of flowers and decorative objects created visual signals that transmitted complex messages about threats and opportunities. Most importantly, these communication networks allowed boys to maintain human connections, despite systematic efforts to isolate them from meaningful relationships. The economic ripple effects of maintaining this institution extended throughout Persian society in ways that created vested interests in its continuation among people who never directly participated in its activities. Textile merchants specialized in producing fabrics that enhanced youthful appearance, understanding that their prosperity depended on satisfying demands they preferred not to examine too closely. Jewelry craftsmen created ornaments designed to emphasize delicate features and vulnerable beauty. Perfume makers developed scents that combined luxury with psychological manipulation, using chemical knowledge to create associations between pleasure and submission. Training in espionage techniques made many boys valuable sources of intelligence about court politics and international relations, as their apparent powerlessness made them nearly invisible to diplomats and nobles who discussed sensitive matters in their presence. They learned to memorize conversations verbatim, while appearing to focus solely on providing entertainment or comfort. Some developed skills in reading documents and correspondence, becoming living libraries of state secrets that their handlers could access through careful questioning disguised as casual conversation. Religious justification for these practices required increasingly creative interpretation of Islamic law and Persian cultural traditions, as the system became more elaborate and harder to disguise. Court clerics developed theological arguments that portrayed the boys as instruments of divine beauty, claiming that their service brought both participants and observers closer to understanding God's perfection. They cited mystical texts about spiritual love while carefully omitting passages that condemned the exploitation of the innocent, creating a sanitized version of religious doctrine that supported the appetites of those who controlled the empire. International recruitment networks expanded to include territories far beyond Persia's direct control, as demand for exceptional boys exceeded the supply available from domestic sources. Diplomatic missions to Central Asian kingdoms included unofficial mandates to identify and acquire suitable candidates through methods that ranged from legitimate purchase agreements to elaborate deceptions that convinced families they were providing their sons with opportunities for advancement. Even hostile neighbors sometimes became unwitting suppliers when border raids captured boys who met the court's specific requirements. The medical knowledge accumulated through systematic abuse of these boys contributed to advances in understanding human psychology and physical development that Persian physicians would never acknowledge publicly. They learned techniques for managing trauma that kept victims functional while preventing the psychological recovery that might lead to resistance or escape attempts. They discovered methods for maintaining physical health in individuals subjected to extreme stress, understanding that damaged goods had no value in markets that demanded perfection. Competition between regional courts intensified demands for exceptional boys, while driving innovations in recruitment and training techniques that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Provincial governors understood that presenting the Shah with particularly beautiful or talented boys could advance their careers more effectively than military victories or administrative achievements. This created markets where human beings were evaluated according to criteria that reduced them to collections of physical attributes and psychological vulnerabilities. Individual survival strategies developed by the boys themselves demonstrated remarkable resilience despite circumstances designed to destroy personal identity and independent thought. Some created elaborate internal fantasy worlds that allowed them to mentally escape during the worst experiences, while maintaining enough awareness to avoid punishments that came with obvious resistance. Others learned to compartmentalize their experiences, treating their roles as performances while protecting core aspects of themselves that remained untouched by external degradation. The documentation of specific cases reveals the human cost of this system in terms that official records systematically concealed or misrepresented. Court physicians' private notes describe boys who developed mysterious ailments that had no physical causes, symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as manifestations of severe psychological trauma. They recorded cases of boys who stopped eating, despite access to luxury foods, who developed nervous conditions that made them unsuitable for their intended purposes, who suffered episodes of despair that sometimes ended in attempts at self-destruction. The artistic legacy of these hidden practices influenced Persian cultural production in ways that remained embedded in literature and visual arts long after the system itself evolved. Court poets composed verses that celebrated ephemeral beauty while encoding warnings about the dangers of attracting too much attention from powerful men. Miniature painters developed techniques for depicting androgynous figures that walked the line between artistic expression and documentary evidence of what occurred behind palace walls. Musicians created compositions that could serve dual purposes, providing entertainment for public gatherings while carrying coded messages between boys who had learned to communicate through musical phrases. Escape attempts, though rare, revealed both the psychological barriers that kept most boys compliant and the elaborate security measures designed to prevent successful flights. Those who tried to flee often found themselves paralyzed by conditioning that had taught them to fear the outside world more than their captivity. They had been convinced that their altered appearance and psychological state made them unsuitable for life among normal people, that they would face rejection and persecution if they attempted to return to conventional society. Even boys who overcame these mental barriers faced physical obstacles that made escape nearly impossible. The palace grounds were designed as much to keep people in as to keep intruders out. Guard rotations were scheduled to ensure that someone was always watching the quarters where boys lived, while the guards themselves were selected for loyalty that transcended normal human sympathy. Many of the security personnel were former boys who had aged out of their primary roles but remained dependent on the system that had created them. Their understanding of escape routes and hiding places made them particularly effective at preventing others from attempting what they themselves had never managed. Geographic isolation provided another layer of security that complemented human surveillance. The most sensitive activities occurred at hunting lodges and mountain retreats that were days of travel from the nearest settlements. Boys who managed to escape the immediate confines of these facilities faced wilderness areas where survival required skills they had never been taught. The few who attempted such flights were usually recaptured within days, weakened by exposure and lack of food, their failed escape serving as object lessons for others who might consider similar attempts. The psychological aftermath of failed escape attempts was carefully orchestrated to reinforce the hopelessness that kept other boys compliant. Recaptured fugitives faced punishments that were designed to be witnessed by their peers, demonstrations of what happened to those who betrayed the trust of their benefactors. These weren't simply beatings or confinement, but psychological torments that broke down whatever remained of individual will. Boys who had shown enough spirit to attempt escape were systematically destroyed as examples, their personalities dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but hollow shells that served as warnings to others. The international diplomatic complications created by this system required constant management by court officials who understood both its importance to their rulers and its potential for creating scandals that could damage Persia's relationships with other powers. European ambassadors who discovered evidence of these practices faced impossible choices between reporting what they had witnessed and maintaining the relationships their nations required for trade and military cooperation. Most chose strategic blindness, filing reports that mentioned the Shah's fondness for beautiful young men, while carefully avoiding details that would force their superiors to take action. Russian envoys, accustomed to their own court's brutalities, nevertheless found Persian practices sufficiently disturbing that several requested early recalls rather than continue witnessing activities that violated even their flexible moral standards. Ottoman diplomats, representing an empire that had its own traditions of exploiting beautiful boys, recognized kindred spirits in their Persian counterparts but worried that the systematized nature of Persian practices might inspire dangerous innovations in their own territories. The boys themselves developed remarkable strategies for maintaining sanity and preserving fragments of their original identities, despite systematic efforts to erase everything that made them individuals. Some created elaborate internal narratives that reframed their experiences as temporary ordeals that would eventually end, though they had no evidence to support such hopes. Others found ways to honor memories of their families and former lives through private rituals that could be performed without attracting attention from their handlers. Religious observance provided one avenue for psychological resistance, as boys could pray for deliverance while appearing to demonstrate the piety that Persian culture officially valued. Some learned to find genuine spiritual comfort in mystical practices that transcended their physical circumstances, developing relationships with divine forces that their captors couldn't control or corrupt. Others used religious frameworks to maintain moral judgments about their situation, preserving the understanding that what was being done to them was wrong even when they lacked power to resist it. The network of suppliers who fed this system extended into the darkest corners of the known world, reaching families whose desperation made them willing to believe lies about opportunities and advancement. Village headmen received commissions for identifying boys who met specific requirements, creating incentive structures that turned community leaders into procurers for systematic abuse. The most effective recruiters understood exactly how to approach different types of families, tailoring their deceptions to exploit particular vulnerabilities and desires. Merchants who traveled regular trade routes often served as talent scouts, keeping detailed notes about promising boys they encountered during their journeys. They learned to recognize the physical characteristics that Persian courts valued while developing expertise in psychological assessment that allowed them to identify boys who would survive the transformation process. These merchants built relationships with families over years, gaining trust that made their eventual betrayal more effective and less likely to generate the kind of resistance that might interfere with future operations. The seasonal rhythms of recruitment followed patterns that maximized success while minimizing detection by authorities who might interfere with the trade in human beings. Spring brought opportunities to approach families during planting season, when agricultural communities faced their greatest financial pressures and were most vulnerable to offers that promised to reduce the burden of feeding extra mouths. Autumn harvests created different opportunities, as successful crops made families more confident about their ability to spare sons for educational opportunities that might benefit entire bloodlines. Training protocols continued to evolve as handlers learned from experience and developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for psychological manipulation. The most skilled practitioners understood that complete destruction of individual personality created useless automatons, while insufficient conditioning left boys with enough independence to resist or cause problems. The art lay in finding the precise balance point where victims retained enough spark to be interesting, while losing the capacity for meaningful resistance. New arrivals underwent assessment procedures that would have impressed the most systematic slave markets, though the criteria used were far more complex than simple physical evaluation. Handlers looked for specific combinations of intelligence and malleability, seeking boys who could learn complex performances while remaining emotionally dependent on their master's approval. They preferred subjects with strong family attachments, understanding that the pain of separation could be weaponized to ensure compliance with demands that might otherwise provoke rebellion. The training itself proceeded through carefully planned stages that gradually normalized increasingly extreme demands. Boys learned to accept minor violations of their dignity before being subjected to more serious abuse, each step justified as preparation for the next level of their education. Handlers used a combination of rewards and punishments to create psychological associations that linked compliance with survival, resistance with suffering. The most effective techniques convinced boys that they were willing participants in their own degradation. Medical interventions became increasingly sophisticated as court physicians developed expertise in manipulating human development to serve the aesthetic preferences of their patrons. They discovered herbal combinations that could delay the onset of adult characteristics, preserving the androgynous appearance that Persian culture associated with perfect beauty. Some treatments affected voice development, preventing the natural deepening that would mark transition to manhood. Others influenced physical growth patterns, maintaining the delicate proportions that made boys valuable as luxury objects. The physicians who administered these treatments developed their expertise through experimentation on human subjects, who had no capacity to refuse participation or report adverse effects. They kept which caused complications that reduced their subjects' value, detailed records of which interventions produced desired results in. This medical knowledge was closely guarded, passed down through apprenticeship systems that ensured techniques remained within small circles of trusted practitioners who understood the importance of discretion. Psychological conditioning techniques evolved through generations of refinement, as handlers learned to exploit specific vulnerabilities that made some individuals more susceptible to control than others. They developed methods for identifying boys who would respond well to different approaches, understanding that techniques effective with one personality type might fail completely with another. The most skilled manipulators could assess a new arrival within days and design customized conditioning programs that would produce optimal results with minimal resistance. The hierarchy within the hidden quarters created complex social dynamics that served multiple functions for those who controlled the system. Competition between boys for favorable treatment ensured that they remained focused on pleasing their handlers rather than developing solidarity that might lead to collective resistance. The mentorship relationships between older and younger boys created additional layers of control, as victims became complicit in perpetuating the abuse that had destroyed their own innocence. Achieved positions of relative privilege that came with their own forms of psychological imprisonment. Boys who survived their initial training and showed aptitude for their roles could. They might be given private quarters, access to luxury goods, and freedom to move through certain areas of the palace without constant supervision. But these privileges came with increased responsibility for ensuring the compliance of newer arrivals, making them active participants in a system they had once resisted. The evening entertainments that provided the primary venue for these boys' exploitation followed rituals as elaborate as any religious ceremony. Preparation could begin days in advance, with specialists attending to every detail of presentation and performance. Boys learned to prepare themselves with the same attention to detail that artists brought to their masterpieces, understanding that any flaw in their appearance or behavior could result in punishment that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of disappointing a patron. The performances themselves were carefully choreographed to provide maximum stimulation while maintaining plausible deniability about their true nature. Boys learned to interpret subtle signals that indicated which type of entertainment was expected, adjusting their behavior to match the desires of their audience without requiring explicit instructions that combined luxury with practical considerations that served the system's need-developed repertoires that could be modified on demand, creating illusions of spontaneity while responses. Private chambers where the most extreme activities occurred were architectural marvels, properties that prevented sounds from traveling beyond there that might create documentary evidence of what occurred. They following scripts designed to manipulate their observers' emotional and physical for secrecy and security. Rooms were designed with acoustic walls, while ventilation systems ensured that evidence of what occurred within them dissipated quickly. Lighting could be adjusted to create specific atmospheres that enhance the boy's appearance, while con systems that developed within this hidden details that might disturb even hardened observers. The communication world allowed boys to share information and provide mutual support, musical selections, and subtle changes in behavior that vary complex messages through arrangements of objects, relationships between victims. They learned to conv while maintaining the appearance of compliance with rules that forbade meaningful lating circumstances designed to destroy their sense of individual. Boys maintained their sanity while Navig networks provided psychological lifelines that help handlers either couldn't detect or chose to ignore. These identity. The economic impact of this created vested interest in its continuation among system extended throughout Persian society in ways that people who never directly witnessed its activities. Entire industries developed around supplying specialized goods required for the boys' care and presentation. Artisans who remote regions where poverty made families vulnerable to deceptions might never have seen the hidden quarters. Nevertheless profited from creating the whose purposes they preferred not to examine too closely. The recruitment networks that supplied this system created their own economies that reached into about opportunity and advancement. Local officials received payments for facilitating the identification luxury items that made the system possible, developing expertise in crafting objects and acquisition of suitable boys, while intermediaries profited from transportation and initial processing. These economic incentives ensured that the system perpetuated itself through networks of complicity that extended far beyond the palace walls where its ultimate purposes were fulfilled. The transformation of boys within the Garden of Nightingales followed them disoriented and desperate for human contact, to sensory deprivation that left softening period, during which new arrivals were subjected patterns that revealed the systematic nature of this hidden institution. Each stage was carefully designed to erode resistance, while preserving the qualities that made victims valuable to their captors. The process began with what handlers euphemistically called the boys were kept in darkened chambers for days or weeks, fed irregularly, and denied access to familiar objects that might provide psychological comfort. When human contact was finally restored, it came in the form of handlers who presented themselves as saviors, rather perfected techniques for exploiting the gratitude that desperate people feel than captors. These manipulators hate toward anyone who relieves their suffering, even when that same person had caused the suffering in the first place. Boys who had been isolated and frightened suddenly found themselves treated with apparent kindness, given comfortable clothing and adequate food, allowed to bathe and rest in about the nature of their situation, making it difficult for boys to maintain clear understanding of pleasant surroundings. This calculated kindness served multiple purposes beyond simple psychological manipulation. It created confusion of who was responsible for their suffering and who was helping them survive it. More importantly, it established patterns of dependency that would prove crucial on the approval of their handlers, creating psychological foundations for the later stages of conditioning. Boys learned that their comfort and safety depended entirely more extreme forms of control that would follow. The educational component of their transformation was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the entire system. Boys were taught to read and write, but only materials that reinforced their subordinate status and celebrated the wisdom of older men who appreciated youthful beauty. They learned poetry and music, but compositions that glorified submission and portrayed resistance as foolishness that brought unnecessary suffering. Mathematical instruction focused on calculating giving that bound them to their patrons. Language, the value of luxury goods, and understanding the economics of gift forms of conditioning that altered how boys thought about themselves and their circumstances. Training went beyond simple vocabulary and grammar to include subtle autonomy. Conversations about their past lives were discouraged through linguistic. They were taught to use specific terms when referring to their bodies' techniques that made it increasingly difficult to articulate memories or words that emphasized availability and desirability rather than personal ownership or emotions connected to their former identities. The most skilled handlers understood that complete erasure of personality created useless automatons, while insufficient conditioning left boys with dangerous capacity for independent thought. They developed technique-zonating traits that might interfere with their intended functions. A boy with service of performances designed to please patrons. For preserving selected aspects of individual character while elim natural musical talent might retain and develop those abilities, but only in intelligence was preserved but redirected toward anticipating and fulfilling the desires of others rather than pursuing personal goals or interests. Physical conditioning accompanied psychological manipulation to create bodies that met Persian aesthetic standards, while serving practical purposes related to their eventual roles. Boys underwent dietary modifications that affected their growth patterns and physical development, consuming foods selected not for nutrition but for their effects on appearance and temperament. Some were given substances that delayed the onset of adult characteristics, preserving the androgynous features that Persian culture associated with perfect beauty. Exercise regimens were designed to maintain flexibility and grace, while avoiding the muscle development that might interfere with their delicate appearance. Boys learned dance movements that emphasized their youth and vulnerability, practicing for hours until these motions became automatic responses to musical cues. They developed skills in massage and other forms of physical service. Their hands trained to provide pleasure while their minds learned to dissociate from the experiences their bodies were forced to endure. The gradual introduction to their actual duties followed patterns that normalized increasingly extreme demands through incremental steps that made each new violation seem like a natural progression from what they had already accepted. Boys who had learned to accept intimate touching during their training found themselves expected to provide more explicit forms of physical service. Those who had mastered the art of pleasing conversation discovered that their audiences expected increasingly personal and degrading forms of entertainment. Resistance at any stage brought swift consequences that were designed not just to punish the individual, but to serve as object lessons for other boys who might consider similar defiance. Punishments were carefully calibrated to cause maximum psychological impact while avoiding permanent physical damage that would reduce the victim's value. A boy who refused to perform might find himself deprived of food and comfort while watching others enjoy privileges that could be his if he simply complied with expectations. The most effective punishments exploited emotional attachments that boys had formed despite efforts to prevent meaningful relationships. A boy who had grown fond of a particular companion might watch that friend suffer consequences for his own disobedience, learning that resistance brought harm not just to himself, but to others he had learned to care about. This technique proved devastatingly effective at breaking down the psychological defenses that might otherwise sustain resistance to the system's demands. The seasonal calendar of court life determined when different aspects of the Garden of Nightingales operated at various levels of intensity. Winter months in Isfahan provided opportunities for elaborate indoor entertainments, where large groups of boys performed for audiences that included foreign dignitaries who were gradually introduced to practices they might initially find shocking. These carefully orchestrated exposures served diplomatic purposes, compromising visitors who might otherwise criticize Persian policies by making them complicit in activities they would find difficult to report to their own governments. Spring hunting expeditions to mountain retreats created opportunities for more intimate gatherings, where normal social constraints disappeared entirely, and the most extreme activities could occur without risk of unwanted observation. These remote locations were selected not just for their isolation, but for their psychological impact on boys who found themselves completely cut off from any possibility of escape or rescue. The beauty of mountain landscapes created surreal contrast with the horror of what occurred within the luxurious pavilions that served as temporary prisons. Summer progresses to other cities required elaborate planning to ensure that favorite boys traveled safely while maintaining the secrecy that protected the system from public scrutiny. Special carriages were constructed with hidden compartments that allowed boys to travel without being seen by ordinary citizens who might ask uncomfortable questions about their presence in royal entourages. Rest stops were carefully planned to occur at facilities controlled by court officials who understood the importance of discretion and the consequences of allowing unauthorized persons to observe the cargo being transported. The boys themselves developed remarkable strategies for psychological survival, despite circumstances designed to destroy individual identity and independent thought. Some created elaborate internal fantasy worlds that allowed them to mentally escape during the worst experiences, while maintaining enough awareness to avoid punishments that came with obvious resistance. These imaginary refugees often incorporated elements from their former lives, allowing them to preserve memories and emotions that their captors sought to erase. Others learned to compartmentalize their experiences, treating their roles as performances while protecting core aspects of themselves that remained untouched by external degradation. They developed internal narratives that distinguished between their true selves and the characters they played for their captors, maintaining psychological boundaries that prevented complete absorption into the identities that had been imposed upon them. This technique required extraordinary mental discipline, but allowed some boys to survive years of abuse while preserving fragments of their original personalities. Religious observance provided another avenue for psychological resistance, as boys could pray for deliverance while appearing to demonstrate the piety that Persian culture officially valued. Some found genuine spiritual comfort in mystical practices that transcended their physical circumstances, developing relationships with divine forces that their captors couldn't control or corrupt. Others used religious frameworks to maintain moral judgments about their situation, preserving the understanding that what was being done to them was wrong even when they lacked power to resist it. The communication networks that developed within the hidden quarters allowed boys to share information and provide mutual support through systems so subtle that handlers either couldn't detect them or chose to ignore activities that didn't directly interfere with their primary objectives. Musical selections during performances could convey warnings about particularly dangerous clients or indicate when someone needed immediate assistance. Arrangements of flowers and decorative objects created visual signals that transmitted complex messages about threats and opportunities. Written communication was impossible due to constant surveillance, but boys developed methods for sharing information through seemingly innocent activities like collaborative artwork or group recitations of poetry. They learned to embed warnings and encouragement within performances that appeared to focus solely on entertaining their audiences, creating dual layers of meaning that allowed them to maintain human connections, despite systematic efforts to isolate them from meaningful relationships. The most successful forms of resistance involved subtle forms of sabotage that couldn't be traced to specific individuals, but created ongoing problems for handlers who struggled to maintain perfect control over their charges. Boys might develop mysterious illnesses during important gatherings, forcing cancellation of events that had required weeks of preparation. They could influence the behavior of newer arrivals through carefully placed suggestions that made conditioning more difficult without appearing to actively undermine their handlers' efforts. Some learned to exploit the vanity and competitiveness of their captors, playing different handlers against each other by reporting conversations or expressing preferences that created jealousy and conflict among those who controlled their daily lives. These techniques required extraordinary psychological sophistication and carried enormous risks, as discovery meant punishments that could destroy whatever remained of their sanity or will to survive. The Garden of Nightingales finally withered when European powers began documenting these practices with the clinical precision of men who understood that such evidence could serve diplomatic purposes. As the Safavid dynasty crumbled under pressure from Ottoman invasions and internal rebellions, the resources required to maintain this hidden empire disappeared along with the rulers who had created it. The boys who survived found themselves abandoned in a world that had no place for what they had become. their stories buried beneath centuries of official silence and deliberate forgetting. Yet their whispers echo still through the ruins of Isfahan, reminding us that behind every golden age of art and culture lie shadows where human beings were consumed to feed the appetites of those who believed their power justified any cruelty. The marble floors still reflect faces, but now they show us our own, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that civilization's greatest achievements often rest on foundations built from the bones of the innocent.